Welcome to this Magic Wand Monday webinar on AAC Implementation. This is part of ESU 13's Monday webinar series. Since we can't give you actual magic wands to help you with all of your problems, we are recording these webinars to share with you the information that we have. This one is on AAC Implementation. We're going to talk about some basics for AAC and an overview of strategies and some goals that you might have or see for kids using AAC. My name is Jessica Broderick. I'm a speech language pathologist with ESU 13, and I also have my assistive technology license, and I am also our secondary transition coordinator. So AAC and assistive tech are things that I am really into and really passionate about, so I hope you find some useful information. You can see on this introduction slide here, my email address is at the bottom. If you have any questions at all or want more information after watching this, please don't hesitate to email me and let me know. So just a few introductory items before we get started. This is a definition from Bukelman and Miranda about what is augmentative and alternative communication. And I wanted to include this to point out that AAC refers to an area of research and clinical practice and educational practice. So there's a ton of research that goes on about AAC and about implementation strategies. And what the whole point is to try to solve these problems that students or adults or whoever have as a result of a communication impairment when they can't communicate, or maybe they don't communicate effectively. AAC can include a whole lot of different things. It's not always just a high-tech speech generating device, and I think we can get caught up in that sometimes. But I wanted to outline some things that are also considered AAC, to include writing, using pictures, using symbols, photos, sign language, or gesturing. So it's pretty much anything except for spoken communication can be considered an augmented or alternative form of communication. The goal of AAC for any person with a communication impairment is to achieve the most effective communication possible, so that person can engage in a variety of interactions and participate in activities of their choice. So that means that they can be involved at school, they can be involved at home, maybe at church, in the community, on a job, whatever they're doing, across all these settings, all these contexts with all these different people. And that they're able to do what they want to do and aren't limited by their communication impairment. So I wanted to just talk about some definitions. When we're talking about AAC, we can be looking at aided communication or unaided communication. And if we are talking about aided communication, that means it's a communication system that requires something else, regardless of what that something is. So some examples of aided communication systems are if the student is using objects to communicate, they're using symbols, a communication book, the point being that they have to have something there with them to help them communicate. Unaided communication is just the opposite and happens without some kind of external tool. So that's using regular speech, that's using sign language, that's using gestures, anything where you don't have to have something else along with you in order to communicate. When we're talking about the different kinds of tech, there are light tech, mid tech, and high tech. So something like a communication board, some picture exchange systems, things like that would be light tech, where you're not using a whole lot of technology to get it done. And on the opposite end of that are high tech devices, which are your speech generating devices, maybe using a computer, using a tablet, using eye gaze, things like that. So a range of technology goes into AAC. Vocabulary. Core vocabulary versus fringe vocabulary. Core vocabulary is what we call words that we use all the time. And that's usually where we start with kids with AAC, is with that core vocabulary. So for example, some things that might be considered core vocabulary would be common verbs like play, run, go, things like that. Asking for more, please, thank you, those kinds of things. Words that we use a lot in our daily life, whereas fringe vocabulary are things that are maybe not relevant to everybody, but are relevant to the students. So fringe vocabulary might be names of family members, favorite TV shows, sports they like to play. Anything that's more individualized for that student is what we consider fringe vocabulary. There are fixed or dynamic display devices. Fixed just means that what you're looking at is not going to change, or what the communicator is looking at is not going to change. So that might be a communication book or a picture board, maybe a pod book. It means that however the student interacts with that thing, whether they're pointing to it or using eye gaze, that display doesn't change. Opposite of that is a dynamic display device, which is something where if the student made a selection on that device, it would go to a different page, or somehow the display would change. We can also have direct or indirect selection methods. Direct selection refers to the student directly touching or pointing to their desired message. Indirect can include things like using a switch to operate a device, so anything where they're not directly touching that. And I tell you all those things to tell you that regardless of what you're using, what the display is, what the selection method is, what kind of tech it is, these strategies that I'm sharing with you and the goals that I'm sharing with you should be relevant for all AAC users and learners. So don't get caught up in thinking these are only if you are using low tech, only if you're using high tech, or anything like that. These are some general ideas and good goals and strategies for all of those. So this section is about setting goals, and I want to run through these 5 communicative competencies. These are from Janice Light and McNaughton, 2014. In 1989, actually, Janice Light came up with 4 communicative competencies that she defined in research as what AAC users needed to be able to do to be successful in using their AAC device. And so in 2014, they reviewed that and looked at some new things and added that 5th one, the motivation, attitude, confidence, and resilience. And so I'm going to go through each of these and explain what they are. I have some sample goals. So if that's something you're struggling with and trying to come up with goals for learners, there are some sample goals. And then at the end, I'm going to go through and give you some strategies for each of those areas to work with students. So the first one is linguistic competence. And what that refers to is just basic skills in the language spoken by the family and community. So these are just your typical language skills. They're receptive skills, expressive skills, and focus on content, form, and use. So this is things like vocabulary, things like knowing how to put sentences together, knowing about plurals and past tense, and all those things. These are all of those core language skills that we use every day to communicate, and kids with AAC need to be able to use to communicate as well. I think a good way to illustrate kind of more specifics about that is to show you some specific goals or sample goals. These goals are from the website Practical AAC, which is an amazing resource for all things AAC. They do weekly videos, they do monthly blogs, they do a bunch of stuff, and I have that linked as a resource at the end of this, so I'll show you more about that. But so some sample goals for linguistic competency would be using core word communication to express sentences of at least 3 words to participate in classroom activities. That second one is about using some grammar things, so using modifiers and prepositions. That third one, choosing a preferred activity, so just making a choice. It would be a linguistic competence. And requesting support, so making choices, requesting support, making grammar, making and learning grammar things, and all those kinds of things would be considered linguistic competencies. Operational competence refers to the technical use of whatever their system is. So this is helping them to make hand or body shapes in order to select what they need to select, or orienting to the device, or getting those movements down. It can also refer to adjusting settings, like turning the volume up, turning the volume down. And at the bottom, I have the question, can the student turn the device on? I think we get really, really good at focusing on some linguistic competence things, like we're going to teach them vocabulary, we're going to teach them sentences, they're going to have longer utterances, they're going to do these things, and we fail to make sure that they can physically use whatever it is. So if it's something that needs turned on, can they turn it on? Do they know how to plug it in? Can they get that book out of their backpack? I mean, if they have a backpack with a zipper, are they able to access it? Is it a place we can access? Can they turn the pages? Do they need help to turn the pages? All of those kinds of things. And it's been my experience that this operational competency piece is something that gets left out a lot when we're working with kids and teaching them how to first use whatever system they're using. So I just want to highlight that. I have some sample goals for that as well. So things like adjusting the volume based on a noise level in the environment. So do they know that when you are out at Walmart, that you might need to turn the volume up because that's a noisy environment, versus when you're working in a small group in school, or maybe you're at Sunday school or something like that, you can turn the volume down because you don't need to be yelling in those environments. That second one is about navigating. So can they navigate from screen to screen, or can they only just go one place? So navigating the device and getting around the device. And that last one's about using built-in features. So if there's word prediction, text prediction, do they know how to use that? Do they know how to use like a search feature if they don't know where to find the vocabulary? Can they use whatever search feature is in the device? Can they change settings? Can they add things if you want them to add things? So all of those are kind of some operational competence things, and I just would encourage you to make sure that you are making sure that the student can do that, because eventually they will leave us, and even if we give them the best linguistic instruction ever, if they don't know that they have to plug the device in and they don't know how to turn it off and on, we're not going to get very far when they leave us. So keep those in mind. Social competence refers to the social skills of interacting with people, of having conversations. So those are things like taking turns, initiating communication, responding to communication, and all of those different functions of communication. So can they ask questions? Can they make comments? Can they give additional information? Can they comment on somebody's feelings? And knowing all of those pragmatic kind of skills that we try to teach kids. Some sample goals for social competence, using an AA system to ask a partner-focused question. And I'll talk more about partner-focused questions as we go on, but asking somebody what they think or how does that make you feel. Inviting a peer to play. So using AAC to initiate a playtime routine if the student's younger. Interact with a peer and take conversational turns and stay on topic. So if we are only getting them to answer one question or ask one question, that's not a true conversation or really meaningful communication interaction necessarily. So taking conversational turns, staying on topic, and greeting people. Can you say hi and goodbye to people? So some examples of goals for social competence areas. The last one I'm going to talk about is strategic competence, which mostly is about how do they handle breakdowns? How are they handling it when things don't go right? How can they bypass those things and still be able to communicate? So as we all know, if you are using something based around technology, there's a good chance that at some point it will break, or you will not get the charger plugged in the right way and it will be dead when you need to go use it. And so what is the backup plan? How will students communicate even if the thing is turned off? Or, you know, somebody spills a glass of water on their communication book, or just stuff that happens. So in addition to those big picture kinds of things, this also talks about how do they repair communication. So if they've said something and the person that they're talking to does not understand the message that they gave to them, can they fix that? Can they say, oh no, wait, that's not what I meant? Or ask for clarification, like I don't understand what you mean, or can you tell me more about that? So making those repairs to conversational breakdowns, as well as when words or phrases they want are not available. Because even if we have the most robust device, sometimes the things that they need to say, some of those fringe vocabulary things are just not on there. So strategic competence focuses around how do they handle those things and how they overcome them. And those are things we need to explicitly teach most of the time. So some goals for strategic competence would be when communicating with unfamiliar partners, the student will use SGD is an abbreviation that stands for speech generating device. So will the student use a speech generating device rather than signing? So just moving maybe from the old way of communicating to the new way. The second one is about communication breakdown. So can they navigate and use an appropriate message to repair miscommunication? Can they do that? Using a message like, wait, I have something more to say, or something like that when they have something longer to say, but they need the other person to wait while they find it, wait while they type it out, something like that. As well as saying things like, okay, I'm going to switch the topic before starting a new subject of conversation so they don't lose the train of thought of the person that they're talking to. I have some resources for you guys that might help you with determining where the students are and what kind of goals they might need. So I'm going to show you guys those real quick. The first one is called the Communication Supports Inventory for Children and Youth. You can find it at icfcy.org. Let me show you that real quick. So the Communication Supports Inventory goes through a bunch of different communication environments and things a student who uses AAC should be able to do. And so then you go through and rate how their communication impairment restricts their participation in these different things. So for example, this first one, you can see it's called restrictions in participation caused by communication limitations. And we're looking at school-related activities. So these are all of the things that would be important for kids to be able to do when they're in school. So everything from playing with others as an educational activity to number 9, social independence activities like being in driver's ed, being in shop, being in home ec, to transition planning for independent living skills. So all of these things that students would need to be able to do when they're in school. And then you can just rate the student. So maybe you don't know, or it's not applicable. So maybe the student, I don't know, has no interest at all in driver's ed, so it's not applicable. So is the restriction no restriction? There's a mild restriction, moderate, severe, or complete. Or maybe they're way better at that than their typical peers, so you can mark that down too. And then this orange column on the right gives you a place to prioritize that for instruction. So if you're going through this and you're like, wow, you know, there's a pretty moderate restriction in that activity, and that is really, really important for the student to be able to do at this point in his or her life, you can make marks to prioritize that for instruction. So same thing all the way down. These were all school-related activities, and then it gets into interpersonal interactions, so relating to people, dating, things like that. Receptive language and literacy, so that's how well they understand language and how well they understand written language as well as oral language. Expressive language, how they express themselves both orally and written language. The different functions of communication, you can go through that. So are they able to refuse or reject something they don't want? Can they request more of something? Can they use social conventions? Can they tell somebody to do something? So all those functions. Following rules of social interaction and conversation. So keeping a socially appropriate distance, ending a conversation appropriately, having a conversation in a group, those kinds of things. And how they use AAC strategies for receptive communication and then expressive communication. So that gets at things like 3D objects, drawings, manual sign, things like that. Motor access for AAC, so maintaining a body position that you need. Controlling fine motor skills in order to access things. There are some questions about impairments in body function, so hearing, vision, touch, respiratory, intellectual, those kinds of things, some things that might affect a user's ability to use AAC effectively. And then there are environmental factors that are either barriers or facilitators. So this gives you a nice list of here's what we're doing really well, here's what we have going for the kid that's really helping them, versus here's some things that maybe that's a barrier, that we need to find a way to overcome this barrier because this is stopping us from getting where we want to go. So things about the physical environment, things about assistive technology, things about the people the student is interacting with, what kind of services they get, and things like that. So this is what the PDF version of this looks like. You can fill it out on their website, actually, and then it gives you like a nice report with all this stuff in it and priorities for instruction, but you can't save it. So this is not a website that you have to make an account for. You can just go in and use it free access, but you can't save it for each student. So if you start on it online and then you leave it, it's gone. So what I always do and recommend other people do is to print this off and then go through it with the team, the teachers, the parents, the related service providers, or whoever that is, and fill it out, and then you can go in and input that information online. So free resource there would help with setting some goals for kids. The other one is the communication matrix, and I'll show you guys that. The communication matrix is a free online tool as well. If you go to communicationmatrix.org, I think it was, or just Google communication matrix, that'll get you there too. And so that one you do have to make an account so you can save students. So you can start something and come back to it later, just so you know. You can also get a PDF version of the questions, which is what I have up on my screen right now. So if you're working through this with the team, parents, something like that, you can have it printed off and take notes and whatever. So you start off by picking one of these 4 statements that talks about the communication skills of a child. So the first one is that they don't have real control over their body yet. I know that they want something because they fuss or whine or cry, and smiles, makes noises, or is calm when they're happy. And then it says, does this statement describe your child? If it does, go to this section. And then it goes through, has control but doesn't use them to try to communicate, or clearly tries to communicate through these different things. And so then each section, so if we went to section C, for example, for that last one, then it goes through each of the communicative functions. So how are they able to refuse or reject something? And it goes through, do they use body movements, early sounds, facial expressions, gestures, conventional gestures, concrete symbols, abstract symbols, or language? And so you go through each of these areas and select how the student communicates that thing. So how do they request more? How do they request a new action? How do they request more of an object? How do they make choices? How do they request a new object? And it goes through all of these things in each of these areas. So then you can take all that information and input it on their website, and it will give you a table that looks like this. This is what the matrix is actually. And so down the left-hand side are different levels. There's levels 1 through 7. So 1 is pre-intentional behavior. So this means they don't have control over things yet. And so if you did not mark that first section on that first page, it's gray. So they're past that. We said, yeah, they can do that. This kind of shows you where you start. Level 2 is about intentional behavior. 3 is about unconventional communication. 4 is about conventional. 5 is about using symbols that are concrete. 6 is about using symbols that are abstract. And then 7 is about using language. And then across the bottom are the functions of communication. So how are they able to refuse things? How do they get things? How do they interact socially? And how do they get and give information? So then you can just kind of cross-reference those and see where the student is at. So you can see the symbol or the key on the top right, and it goes through. If it's gray, they've surpassed it. If it's orange, it's something they've mastered. They can do it. We're good. If it's yellow, it's something that's emerging, so maybe something you're currently working on. And white is something that's not used. So that could be a future goal, or it's just something that they don't need. You know, for example, if the student is using language, they wouldn't necessarily need to be able to use sign language or something like that. So this gives you a nice visual of things that they can do, things that we're working on, and future goals, and is in a nice visual that's pretty parent friendly too. So those are some resources for you. The next part I wanted to talk about are how do we support kids that are using AAC, and how do we give them opportunities to learn and to be successful. This is one of my favorite quotes, and it says, "Technology alone does not make a competent communicator any more than a piano makes a musician or a basketball and a hoop make an athlete." And that's David Bukelman again, who is at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and is, does a lot of research into AAC. And I love that because I think, you know, we make this great system, we do this these awesome trials. We're like, yeah, the kid can use this. This is great. This is going to be so awesome. And we give it to them, and then they get just a little bit of instruction, and then we wonder why they can't use it or why they're not proficient. And so when we think about teaching AAC users to use their system or their device or whatever they have, I want you to keep in mind typical language development. So, you know, by the time your average child starts saying a few words around the age of 1, they've had 12 whole months of exposure to language. And so one of the most important things is to expose kids to aided language or alternative language or augmented language, whatever it is. You have to expose them over and over and over, because we don't give typical babies, you know, we talk to them 1 hour a day and expect that when they turn 1 year old, they will start picking up words. So the development of language in AAC mirrors the development of language in typical kids too. So I want you to keep that in mind. The most important strategy, if you've listened to nothing else I'm saying, is to model your language. We can't expect individuals using AAC to learn how to use it without seeing it in action. So that means when you're talking to that kid, you're showing them on the device what you're saying. When you're expanding on what they're saying, you're showing it to them on the device. So you're using whatever they're using to communicate as your model. You're using it too. And I heard Erin Sheldon say once at an assistive technology conference that to be a good language model for AAC, you only have to know one more thing than the student does. You only have to be able to add one more thing. So if they're talking about the picture that they've painted green, you only have to be able to add one more thing to that. So even if you are learning right along with them, as long as you have one more thing to say, one more thing to add, you're going to be a good language model. And I think it's important, you know, a lot of our high-tech things have built-in find features. So if you can't find what you're looking for, you can go in and you can type it, and it'll show you where to find it. And I think it's really important. We have to model that too, so students know how to use that feature and that it's there. So it's okay to say, oh, you know, I really want to talk about grasshoppers, but I don't know where the grasshopper button is, so let me find it. And showing them that it's okay to not know where it is, to not know the word for something. And so to model that strategic piece of the communication breakdowns too. So model everything. It's called aided language input. If I say that, that means the same thing. It means that you're using whatever the kid is using as an example for them. So just some simple tips, regardless of what you're using and regardless of what you're working on. Always support their communication attempts. So even if it doesn't make sense, even if you're like, that's not even what we're talking about right now, support it and comment on it and expand on it. Only speak for yourself. So you should never be working with a student's device, and if somebody asks the student a question, you know, like what's your favorite color, putting your voice or your choices onto the student, if that makes sense. So you can model, like, my favorite color is green, but you want to make sure that what the student is saying, what you're helping them say, is what they want to say, and it's their voice and their choice. Ask open-ended questions of the student. So don't stick to yes, no. Yes, no is important, but it's definitely not the only thing that we need to be able to do. So focus on asking those open-ended questions. Use an appropriate prompting hierarchy. The prompting hierarchy for AAC is a little bit different. then verbal prompting hierarchy. I have that on the next slide. And then provide environments to facilitate communication. So set up environments, set up activities, set up games where you know that student will be able to engage and have a turn to answer or to comment or whatever, and set up those environments and contexts so we can work on getting language. This is the prompting hierarchy. At the very bottom, I want to point out, it says stop before you prompt. So for a student who is just learning to use AAC, it takes a while. And if you are also learning how to use that communication book or that whatever, you will stumble through it. No matter how much you think you know about it, when you first start to use it, you will stumble through it. So a good rule of thumb is to wait 10 seconds for the student to respond before you start to try to help them or prompt them. And that seems like a long time, and it is a long time. And when you ask a student a question and then you just sit there with no response for 10 seconds, feels awkward. But do it, because it's important for them to be able to have the time to try to find things on their own, to try to communicate on their own. And then from the bottom up is most to least prompting. There's hand, underhand, full physical prompt, partial physical prompt, modeling. And then in italics, you can see that modeling is an important part of aided language stimulation. So we always want to do that. A visual prompt, a verbal prompt, a point prompt, and hopefully they end up at the top where they're independent. So I wanted to show you that and have you put some thought into where your student is at in a prompting hierarchy and how much support they need. Be sure you're not over prompting and giving them the dignity of risk and letting them try it on their own before we just jump in and try to help them more than they need. Strategies for linguistic competence. We need to be providing early intervention. This study by Husted showed that 80% of children are older than age 2 when they start to receive AAC services. And as we know, as far as typical language development, there is a huge burst of language development between the ages of 1 and 2. And so when that burst is supposed to be happening, these kids don't have a way to communicate, so they miss out on that big burst. So if this is a child that you are even remotely thinking might be an AAC user in the future, start early. We want to introduce a wide range of concepts, so we don't want to just give them labels for things. We don't want to be able to just tact things. We want to be able for them to ask and answer questions, so we need to model those things. We need to show them how you ask questions, how you answer questions, how to use social expressions, how to use interjections, and how to use humor, like all these different concepts. Don't focus just on labeling things. We want to give them access to things right away. So because a lot of these kids have missed out on that really important piece between the ages of 1 and 2, they might not have the language knowledge. And there's not really a prerequisite for being an AAC user. It's not like you have to know this first before you can do this other thing or get this device or this system or whatever. We want to presume that they will figure it out. And so we don't want to have to, for them to have to do things for us first. We just want to support children in learning language via AAC. So they might not have the expressive skills or the receptive skills or just overall language skills. So you might be teaching the vocabulary, teaching language concepts at the same time you're teaching the AAC. Give them access to all of those concepts. Don't just pick and choose. So we want to pick motivating and meaningful contexts in their natural environment. So capturing those opportunities when they're excited about something, when they like something, when they're doing something in their classroom. Try to work in those natural environments as much as possible, using modeling like we talked about. And then when they have expressed something to you, expand on that and model more complex language. And this is kind of where what I said earlier comes in about you only have to know one more thing than the student knows to expand on something. You only have to know where one more word is. So give them more language, more information, just like we would do with typically developing kids. when they've said, you know, big dog, we would say, yeah, that is a big dog, and oh, look, it's a white dog, it's a fluffy dog. So expand on a child's AAC utterances, just like we do on their verbal utterances. Operational competence is mostly about providing a lot of practice, a lot of practice. Reduce the complexity if possible. So if you're working with a student who can only handle a choice of 4 things, you know, start there and then add to that later. Or maybe, you know, if you have 10 pages of a communication book, start them off with 5. Always consider the developmental stage. So for younger kids, something that's a visual scene display might be better. And what that refers to is that maybe you have a picture of their bedroom, and if they touch the bed, it brings up things talking about going to bed or a nighttime routine. If they touch the picture of the bookcase, there's some vocabulary about reading books and things like that. And then as students get older and they start to be at an age where they would be using those reading or writing skills, give them access to that kind of stuff too. Social competence, this is where there's partner-focused questions come in. So teach and practice asking questions of another person. So what do you think about that? What was your favorite part? So asking and answering those things to give them ways to interact with other kids or adults. Construct context for interaction. So set up playing a game, set up playing something together, set up a social group or an interaction opportunity where they will have plenty of practice chances. Give them vocabulary for social activities, for making comments, for talking to their peers. Use the vocabulary that the peers are using, even if those are kind of strange words, especially if they're teenagers, you know. And then build those opportunities for practice in different contexts and environments. So if you've practiced with a student, then maybe move them to practicing those same skills with a group of just 2 or 3 peers. And then maybe they can practice the whole class, and then maybe they can practice the next time you're on a field trip. So as they get those skills and start to grow in those skills to go a little bit further each time, a little bit more out of their comfort zone, and support them through that. Strategic competence, my best advice is to practice those breakdowns. Practice the student saying a message and you saying, oh, I didn't understand that, or can you tell me more? Explicitly teach them what to do when that happens so they're prepared and they know, and then have and practice a backup plan, especially if you're using something high tech. It's probably going to break at some point, the battery is going to die, something's going to happen, and so have a backup plan. So if their main communication system goes down or is broken or something happens to it, it's lost, who knows, that there is a backup that they have, and practice the backup too. These are the resources I referenced earlier. That Practical AAC website is awesome. You could find your answer to pretty much any question you have there. So I'd encourage you to check that out if you have more questions. Penn State also has a really awesome AAC program, and they have some resources there too. So you could check out the AAC at PSU website as well. And the last thing I wanted to leave you with is just a piece of this video. This is Chris Klein. He is an adult with cerebral palsy who is an AAC user. He accesses it with his feet, as you can see. And here he's being asked, what's your best advice to give to SLPs? And I'm just going to play a little bit of this video because I think it's pretty cool. And then we will be done.
Hey, Chris. I have 2 questions. One is, what would be your top advice to speech pathologists working with AAC? And do you still play a lot of safe ball?
Helping E. It does get way. With them. She is working and my friends are helping me. So yes, it does get way. First question. Y C H backslash CH. Answer is you have to make communication fun by saying that I need play a game with them. Talk about something they like and just even E, B, C, F, C, encourage them to play with the device themselves. I don't think we do enough of that, and I believe that that's a problem. The first question I answer is you have to make communication fun by saying that I need to play a game with them and talk about something they like and just encourage them to play with the device themselves. I don't think we do enough of that, and I believe it's a problem.
Is working with AAC and being